Hey everyone, thank you very much for attending. Just gonna give it a couple seconds here. I see a few more people filtering in. Okay, I think we can get started. And seeing anyone join in just a couple seconds. Thanks everyone for being here. Today we're going to be covering the most dangerous threats to cloud storage in Q1 of 2025. So this is presented by Casmer Labs. This is Cloud Storage Security's internal threat laboratory. What we do is we keep tabs on emerging trends, on malware, misconfigurations, cyber attacks, pretty much anything and everything that affects the storage layer. I am Connor. I am the product manager here at CSS for malware protection and data security solutions. Also present here is Pepe. He is the lead researcher for Casmer Labs. So if you have any questions for him, drop them in the chat and he'll be able to answer them. Got to give a quick summary. We're CSS, Cloud Storage Security, and we protect all data everywhere. We protect data stored in the cloud and on premises as of pretty soon, so that businesses can move forward freely and fearlessly. So let's start with a 2024 retrospect and some of the predictions that we actually had. When we did our nastiest threats of 2024, we talked a lot about how it's going to continue. It has been happening. Organizations are going to migrate in the cloud, and a lot of organizations actually default to the cloud when they're building new applications, new workloads. When they have a need, increasingly they go to the cloud. And what this means is that more data is moving to the cloud. We also see that data breaches in the cloud are common. 40% of data breaches were cloud based. And this is as of the IBM cost of a data breach report. You can see the citations down at the bottom right. Same story. Data breaches in the cloud are costly, right? Unlike on premise, average cost is about 5.17 million, and it's been increasingly at a pretty steady rate of about 13% since 2023. So it's been going up, and it's going to continue increasing as the scale of applications in the cloud grow larger. There's more data. There's more to be lost. There's more compliance fines to be paid, and so on and so forth. And as of our 2024 predictions, we see that attackers have continued to shift their focus towards data. So we've been monitoring, we've been watching, we've been looking, and we've been doing analysis. And the top threats that we encountered in Q1 are anything that caused data breaches, right? So attackers have kind of shift their focus over there. It's the most profitable for attackers in many ways. Data is expensive, especially on the dark web. And the top threats that we encountered were all significant risks of data breaches. So, misconfiguration, exploitation, ransomware intrusion, and malware ingestion. We'll get into these in just a couple seconds here individually, but something that we want to bring up is that the barrier to entry to carrying out cyber attacks, to carrying out data breaches, has significantly reduced year over year. And this is something that has been brought on by ransomware as a service, malware as a service, kind of as we call it, the democratization of a lot of these attack vectors, right? If you have enough money, or even not a lot of money at all, some ransomware as a service vendors start at about $50 a month. You can get a pretty much net new piece of ransomware, and you can go after a large organization, steal their data, and then sell it. Increasingly, we also find that internal human error is the source of a lot of these vulnerabilities that result in data breaches. So we will, of course, cover these through, but this is another major, very high level industry trend that we find going on over and over again. So we're going to start with the first major attack vector, and this is misconfiguration exploitation. The summary, the very high level. It's a hole in security policies, especially in the cloud. So when you think of main things, kind of in order actually, public read and write access, encryption disabled at rest, and access logging not enabled are the three major misconfiguration issues that we find. Now, I say here on the slides, it's public read and write. That's the easiest misconfiguration for cyber criminals to exploit. And that's been proven true time and time again. That's how tens of millions of records have been breached in quarter one of 2025 alone. And what I'd like to kind of note is that these are only the data breaches that have been reported and otherwise publicized. So, something to think about there. A lot of these attackers will go and look proactively for misconfigured storage repositories. So if you have a misconfigured bucket, people are looking for it, and if it's not solved in time, people will find it. They'll look for sensitive information, and then they will, we say exfiltrate, but they will download the data. Um, Unmonitored data in storage with default or no permissions or encryption settings are prime opportunities. So that data is readily available to be downloaded. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's a serious issue, and that's why we bring it up as a risk. So the major misconfiguration incidents that we talk about, there's a ton, there's a lot, but the two big ones that we want to talk about are Hip Shipper, and this was highly publicized. It was a publicly accessible Amazon S3 bucket that was discovered, I believe, in February of this year, and it had over 14 million shipping labels on it. That's a lot of PII essentially. It had addresses, it had email addresses, phone numbers, full names, things like that, and that doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize that that data was then sold on the dark web, or could be sold on the dark web to supplement social engineering and phishing tactics. If someone is to find your email address, that's one thing. But if a bad actor were to find a connecting phone number and full name, that gives them a serious boost to any social engineering tactics. Another one was Oberlin Marketing. So this was another publicly accessible Amazon S3 bucket. Over 320,000 sensitive files, and most of them which were Medicare applications. So if you think of that, social security numbers, full names, addresses, email addresses, whatever you can think of was breached, lost, and probably sold on the dark web for malicious use by other bad actors for a profit. So we talk about the consequences. A lot of it is pretty obvious, but we talk about data loss, right? Your data is gone. It's a pretty big deal, especially if you don't have backups to go ahead and recover, and you have to notify your customers again that we actually lost that data. System outages is another thing that I want to call out, right? Data loss, especially if it's in an important part of an application, can take it down entirely and disrupt a service for your customers as well. So that kind of contributes to the loss of those customers, loss of prospects, especially if a data breach is highly publicized, reputational damage that goes around with it, and then AWS account suspension. This actually works for a lot of the major accounts. Uh, AWS is highly committed to its customers, but in the case that it is breached and it may look like a an attack from within, they will suspend your account on a case by case basis. So when we talk about remediation, five practices your organization can take today is that obviously need to make sure that none of your buckets, especially those with sensitive information, are not publicly viewable or accessible. Obviously, there's a big difference between a bucket hosting web assets, and one that's housing Medicare applications or employee resumes. Even that's another common one. You need to implement notifications when new storage resources are created. That just goes without saying. And configuring default values. Right, there's a ton of buckets in a lot of these major organizations and even smaller organizations, 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000. It's pretty difficult to go through them manually and figure out how they're configured. So configuring those default values to enforce encryption at rest, um, only accepting HTTPS requests, so on and so forth, is really important to minimize that human error. Least privilege, we talk about this all the time, but regularly reviewing these access control policies or ACLs, we want to make sure that people only need access, or rather have access to what they need to do their job. And then the final thing, and what that we talk about a lot, is continual education. Talking over and over again about making sure that your employees are regularly trained, that they're regularly educated on these threats, specifically misconfigurations, and a lot of these threats that have human error components to them as well. With misconfiguration done, we're going to talk about ransomware intrusion. So, a quick summary, right? Ransomware, we all know, can be both file borne and also, as of recent, fileless. So, fileless malware kind of involves reconnaissance in the initial compromise. So, this means, okay, I'm going to scope out this organization. I'm going to figure out if they have compromised credentials, maybe from a past data breach, maybe from social engineering. Are these employees rather vulnerable to that? And then getting their login and getting access to a certain cloud account. It's establishment of a foothold and then the escalation of privileges. So in this way, using those keys and using that initial compromise to find a way to get access. For example, if someone finds credentials that are, let's say, marketing only, is figuring out a way to expand that access to maybe an IT director's level of permission so they can inflict more damage. It's that internal reconnaissance, lateral movement, and the maintenance of presence. So basically, staying in there, figuring out what they can attack, what they can find, what they can exfiltrate, um, and then carrying out on that in the completion of the mission, which is a ransom note and a payment, mostly in terms of Bitcoin. Financial impacts, regulatory fines, remediation fees, and then the ransom itself. So ransomware attacks are really, really expensive. Everybody knows that. But the sensitive data loss, especially without backups, we'll talk about this, and I talk about it again and again, is super important. Reputational damage. You don't want your organization in the news. And then as a result of that is revenue loss with customers. So we talk about ransomware attacks, specifically fileless ransomware attacks in quarter 1 of 2025. The big one that kind of stands out is the Codefinger campaign. And I want to preface this by saying that it was very heavily covered in the news. In many ways, it was a little bit overblown, but a lot of organizations have kind of kept, or rather made the appropriate decisions that they needed to make sure that these were not happening, and they're not actually vulnerable to an attack as carried out by the Codefinger group. So it was a fileless ransomware campaign. It was an organized group of cyber actors. They kind of went after everyone simultaneously all the time, and it actually used native services that are designed to help customers, but they actually turned those against the cloud user themselves. A lot of the exact victims were kind of unknown and undisclosed at this time, but you can see on the right the way it kind of goes, and it maps almost perfectly to the cyber attack lifestyle, is obtaining those AWS credentials. That's the initial compromise. Locating AWS keys that have, for I believe it's get and put object permissions on certain buckets. That's kind of the escalation of permissions, and then they went ahead and carried out the attack. And this started with encrypting files using AWS SSEC, um, encryption using customer provided keys. And that means, for those who don't know, that the encryption key can actually be stored locally and not in AWS KMS or some other key manager or management service. And then they set a policy, an SRE lifecycle policy, to delete those files in 7 days. You can't turn it off, only the attacker can, unless you pay the ransom. And that's where they leave the ransom note, usually in the form of a demand. So they'll say, do not contact the police. If you do not pay us, you will not get your files back. And they'll set the address to a Bitcoin wallet. Prevention and detection methods. These have mostly been widely covered by the industry at this point, but regularly rotating credentials, strong password policy, including multi factor authentication. That's security 101, extremely important. Same with IAM controls, least privilege to make sure that those AWS keys are not granting access to things they shouldn't be. Um, Ideally, the use of AWS keys at all is kind of highly discouraged. Instead, creating temporary IAM roles if that's needed. Monitoring AWS CrowdTrail logs. If a bunch of files are encrypted in mass using SSEC, that might be cause for concern, especially if your organization does not use SSEC. And then also using anomaly detection tools to flag, let's call it abnormal account access. We talk about regularly auditing AWS accounts, making sure that there's something there that is looking at all of these CloudTrail logs and ensuring that nothing bad is happening based on their model. In some cases, hard coded, but any alarm is actually better than no alarm at all. Number one is maintaining offline backups. It's it's really simple, but a lot of large organizations don't actually do this, and there's price considerations to that, and we understand that. But backups will allow you to recover your data and restore back into production as fast as possible. When we talk about incident response planning, we talk about education, is training teams on secure coding, programming, architectural practices to avoid hard coded credentials. That's one thing. And then also phishing and credential compromise tactics. That's in many ways the ways that that code finger kicks itself off. And it's super important to make sure that your employees know what they're talking about, that they're consistently reminded that this is a real threat, and the consequences can be severe if not. Finally, we'll talk about malware ingestion, the third major threat that we saw in Q1 of 2025. Malware explained. We'll just go over the facts, lay a baseline, but the threat summary is that malware is often ingested into your cloud storage in any one of a number of ways, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The risk is most significantly downstream. So being distributed to your employees, your partners, your other users via an application, a workflow, unmonitored APIs, whatever it might be. And then they go ahead and they double click on it and they detonate it on their local machine. The consequences are dire. We all know this, but financial impacts, regulatory fines, remediation fees, the ransom itself, losing sensitive data. We've covered this a lot. Reputational damage, revenue loss with customers. We also want to talk a lot and kind of um, make sure everybody knows that applications can go down, and that's losing service to your customers for something that they paid for. Um, this malware in particular, especially if it propagates across networks, can be extremely detrimental. So, how malware is ingested. Compromised credentials, exploited APIs. So, we mean that somebody can somehow get access to your storage volumes and upload a piece of malware there for it to later be downloaded to a local machine and then to detonate. Phishing attacks, another common one. Everybody gets phishing emails all the time, but if someone were to download any file attached to a phishing email, that could also be a method of malware detonation or ingestion. Automated integrations, talk about this a lot. There's some managed file transfer services that are maybe pulling data up from on premises, dormant data as well. We talk about this, but if a file is only scanned once, let's say on the endpoint before it's uploaded, and then it turns out that it's a relatively new piece of malware. Let's say that your desktop antivirus doesn't actually have the signatures to catch that piece of malware. That will happen as well, and it can actually get lost without regular scanning, and then find its way down to another local machine in a pretty short amount of time. Development and testing environments. A lot of these are surprisingly considered somewhat safe havens for a lot of data, but they are not. So this data can move laterally between dev, test, prod, so on and so forth, and it can actually detonate that way if it's brought down. And then we talk about application generated data as well. So it's not entirely uncommon, although it is the least common that we've seen for an application to actually generate data, especially with Gen AI, for it to actually have pieces of malicious code in there. And it's pretty super uncommon, but it is still an ingestion path that we have seen at least on 2 occasions. So when we talk about these malware threats, in quarter 1 of 2025, very broadly in terms of the malware families themselves, we'll go through these. So number one, were botnets, right? Botnets are designed to basically turn your computer into a zombie, and to connect to a central server and then launch direct denial of service attacks, maybe to crypto mine, um, basically to carry out the will of the person in control of that botnet. So definitely don't want your organization's computers to be enlisted in something like that. The second, and this is something that I really want to call out, this is a prediction that we made at the beginning of the year, but attackers are going to focus and continue to shift their focus towards data. So these info sealers in particular, and the rising popularity of them in the last 6 to 9 months have kind of demonstrated that. And a lot of these info stealers will go on to a local machine. They'll look for crypto wallets. They'll look for credentials. They'll look for PII based on some sort of regular expression or another method as well. And they will steal that sensitive information in particular, and then exfiltrate that outward. Number three in Q1 was what were rats and remote access Trojans. And so a lot of these particularly are pretty dangerous because they'll go onto your computer. Obviously, it's kind of like TeamViewer, where someone across the world could potentially have access to your local machine. And then that kind of gives them the ability to do, frankly, whatever they want with your organization's computer or your personal computer. They're exceptionally dangerous. They can inject botnet malware. They can inject an info stealer. They could quite literally do whatever they want. So we talk about malware prevention methods a lot. The number one is applying event-based malware scanning policies to your cloud storage resources, especially if your organization works in the cloud. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but there's an entire possibility that as malware iterates every day and every second of every day, and new malware is coming out, that a single scanning engine might not be able to catch it on a local machine. So making sure that you kind of have this defense in depth, that you have a number of malware scanning engines all going over a single file will help drastically reduce the false negative rate. Adopting a zero trust approach. I just talked about that, but trust no file, right? If you ingest it, there's no real way to kind of guarantee that a customer or a partner or a local machine, even an employee, has their stuff set up correctly and they're actually scanning these files for malware. So we say trust but verify. If you're ingesting files, you assume the best, but there's no real way to make sure that that organization is actually implementing those security policies, and there's no real way, unless you scan it yourself, to prove that those files are scanned and cleaned and the security has been verified. Again, least privileged access for who can upload or download files. So we want to make sure that nobody unauthorized is uploading malicious file to your cloud storage, knowing that it's going to make it down to an employee at some point. Versioning and backups in case these active strikes. Talked about this many times before, but it's still important, especially for malware. And then the final part, knowing what's in your buckets, how they're configured, and who has access. And this is kind of a combination of a lot of our best practices and what we talk about. But you need to know, is there malware in my buckets? Is there sensitive information in my buckets? Are they publicly accessible? And if worse comes to worse, does a random person from the public internet have access to upload to these buckets? We'll talk about some themes here. In quarter 1, we kind of put our heads together and we talked about what we've seen. We organized our research and we kind of brought together the most major themes. So misconfigured permissions, reliance on default configuration. We see that again. Large organizations, massive organizations that have publicly accessible buckets, and a lot of them are the result of not enforcing a private only access on default. It's poor monitoring and alerting practices as well. So the lack of maybe an anomaly detection system. We talked about Codefinger. Again, I've kind of said that that's overblown, but the companies that did get hit by that did not seem to notice tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of files being encrypted with SSEC. That just goes to show that they did not have the best alerting practices. Lack of encryption for data at rest, right? We know this, but the way encryption works is that the data is useless if they don't have the key. So a lot of these data breaches come from unencrypted files sitting in a public bucket. That's actually a dual pronged, I'd say, mistake from their side. Human error as well. I've said it multiple times, but an organization who has thousands of buckets, it's pretty difficult to make sure that all of them are configured correctly. And then finally, the lack of proactive malware protection. So as that malware finds its way into the cloud and then downstream for detonation, um, there was nothing to catch it. So the local machines didn't catch it in both places using just one malware scanning engine. There is an opportunity to kind of implement malware protection in the middle somewhere in the cloud so that there's potentially multiple layers of malware protection and malware scanning, all using different engines to kind of get very close to that five nines of, of true positives and true negatives if needed. What to consider. So our team anticipates more high profile data breaches. We saw it last year with Change Healthcare. We saw it this year again with Hip Shipper. There's going to be more. It's just how it is. A lot of organizations are getting hit, and it's truly unfortunate because millions of records for their users are being they're being leaked. But we keep seeing it happening, unfortunately. The monetary and reputational consequences for cloud data breaches are going to continue to rise. And the reason why we say that is that more data in the cloud means more possible records breached, which means paying for more credit monitoring for more customers, which means more remediation. The list kind of goes on from there. And then we also finally anticipate a continuation of lowering barriers for malicious actors. So, ransomware as a service, malware as a service, more sophisticated pay tools. There's not a ton of evidence on it right now, but there is the ability to get Gen AI applications through some pretty, let's say, convincing prompt engineering to actually generate malicious code for someone who knows absolutely nothing about how to build and engineer a piece of malware. So that's something to consider as well. What should you do today? So ideally, you go back and look through all of the security configuration policies and minimize the risk of misconfigurations, right? And at the moment, this is pretty manual, but it is entirely necessary to make sure that the public buckets that you have need to be public. For example, like I said earlier, web assets. But if you have a public bucket that should not be public, especially one that has sensitive information, is catching that now before a malicious actor finds that. Proactive malware scanning into your cloud environment, even though it's not executable. And we talk a lot about this downstream risk, making sure that you are implementing that scanning. Uh, so, number one, that stuff does not make it down to a local machine, detonate there, and propagate throughout your network. And the third one, and this is by far the most important, especially talking about all of this human error, is periodically educating yourself and your employees on ransomware and misconfiguration prevention. So we recommend quarterly. You can do this twice a year, once a year, but we really want our customers and our users and everyone else in the great wide world to host these training exercises and frankly to make sure that your employees know exactly what they need to be looking out for. They need to be knowing about phishing attacks, recent trends with that, and especially how to prevent misconfiguration incidents, as that is the most important one that we faced. So, how does CSS help? We've kind of concluded a lot of that in the presentation, but we do in-tenant malware protection for AWS, Azure, and GCP. So we support S3, EBS, EFS, FSX, Azure Blob, and Google Cloud Storage, all from a single console. What our customers love about us is that we do two premium CISA vetted malware scanning engines. So that's actually three engines in total. And we find that we can get very close to that five nines of accuracy and false positives and false negatives. They also love the scan models. So when we talk about it, we have event-based malware scanning. As files are dropped into an Amazon S3 bucket, they are scanned as they arrive. The retro scanning model allows them to set a schedule on all of their stuff to periodically rescan this data with new definitions, and to make sure that there's, if there's a 0 day piece of malware, something that hasn't been detected yet by a major antivirus engine provider, that's actually caught a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks down the line as soon as those signatures are added. The quarantining and the remediation options are pretty cool. So we actually show those off, and our customers love them because it allows you to take a piece of malware if you're not entirely sure what it might be, or actually what it might even do if it was detonated downstream. We can actually detonate that piece of malware for you and show you what kind of processes it's going to spin up, what IPs it's going to connect to, so on and so forth. And then finally, the bucket settings page. So we talk about the configuration status. We look at encryption. We look at whether or not this bucket is public. So we actually help organizations make sure that they're not leaving unencrypted files in a publicly accessible bucket, um, for the entire internet to see, including bad actors. With that, we're going to conclude. So, thank you all so very much for attending. We really appreciate it. Our malware scanning solution is available on AWS Marketplace. So, we have a 30-day free trial. We give you guys a bunch of data so you can go to baseline your own files. You can set up event based scanning, and kind of verify the data, or, sorry, the security of data that's coming into your environment. Um, for about 30 days. So you can figure out the solution works for you. You can kind of kick off your own proof of concept, make sure that it's not disrupting anything. Um, and if you have any more questions, if you want to talk to a subject matter expert, such as myself or the guys at Casmer Labs, you can reach out to sales at cloudstorage.sec.com right up there on your screen. If you'd like to see the slides, they're actually down below. And the link to AWS Marketplace is also down below in the description. Thank you, everyone, so much for attending. It doesn't look like we have any questions here, but with that, I'm going to, yeah, I think I'm gonna cut it off. Thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and have a great weekend.